Paul, whenever you're ready. This is Paul Barker. We have a lot of Pauls here. Paul Barker.
It's too many Pauls.
Here I am. Yes, we have far too many Pauls in this. We had this confusion in Afghanistan. There were only two Pauls. Now we got three. So it was my great pleasure to get to know Paul O'Brien. First, when we were both working in East Africa, I was in Tanzania. I think you were based in Nairobi, and he was what was the title? Africa Policy Advisor for Care International. And I had worked in Afghanistan earlier, and Afghanistan just wasn't in the news, and it wasn't getting any money. And we were trying to think, how can we put Afghanistan on the map, and so people know where it is, and they'll be inspired to give us money for all these great programs we want to do in Afghanistan. And so we got our visas to go for a workshop in Pakistan to figure out how to do this. And then 9/11 happened. But we already had our visas. So we ended up in first Islamabad, and then later in Peshawar, and then Kabul, working on Afghan-related advocacy work. We did that for a few years. Paul O'Brien eventually left CARE and went to work for Ashraf Ghani at the Ministry of Finance. And we still coordinated on our advocacy policy issues. Times went on. Paul ended up going to the US to work for Oxfam. And then since 2021, I believe, you've been the executive director of Amnesty International USA. And Amnesty International has got a certain reputation for its work, well-deserved, I think, and they've taken the position that genocide is indeed happening in Gaza. And I thought it would be great if we could get Paul to share some of his insights and how they came to that conclusion, what it really means for them and for the rest of us, and how we can wrestle with this moving forward. So I think the idea is to have Paul speak for 20 minutes, half hour, something like that, to tell us how Amnesty International got to where it is, and then we'll have some question and answer and take it from there. Paul.
Well, thank you, Paul, and Paul and Nora. It's great to see you both. I see some old friends also on this listed here, and it's just really good to be in this moment. I want to start with, we have some sober things to talk about, but on a lighter note, in my life, one of the things I do with my wife and some friends is play silly New York Times games, and the name that I have been bestowed for all these games is Seamus, because Paul Barker and I couldn't work out how to have two Pauls living in the same house for 2 years. So I think Paul and another of our housemates just said, well, let's just call the Irish one Seamus. And 15 years later, it's still going, Paul, you'll be glad to hear. For your amusement, I do an exercise class. One other story before we get going. I do an exercise class, and I have done for years here and in Washington, D.C. It's a neighborhood class. And it's been a real source of community and strength for me early in the morning. But it's one of those things where nobody really knows what anybody else does or who they are. But I am coming to the end of my time at Amnesty, retiring, and a friend of mine invited me out for dinner this evening, and I said, well, I can only have a quiet dinner because I have a presentation to do and a conversation to have on a sober topic. He said, no problem, we'll have a quiet dinner. Little did I know, about 2 hours ago, I walked into a room where there were 35 of my exercise class deciding to have a little surprise party. And many of the people in my exercise class, wonderful people, many of them are from the Jewish community. And my friend, who's an Irishman, said, well, you'll all be delighted to know that Paul can only be with us for an hour and a half because he has to go and explain why Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. And the whole room, which had gathered for a surprise party, then, and they didn't even know what I did for a living, many of them. I then spent the next hour and a half answering, so why is it that you work on genocide again? Can you explain that to me? So I've been prepping for this conversation for the last hour and a half in a way that I wasn't expecting to. So anyway, and it was actually a good conversation. I think what's going on in the Jewish community in terms of understanding the consequences of the actions of Israel is actually a very important thing. And there was a lot of grace shown, and we had good conversations, but it has not been a difficult thing. Anyway, I thought I'd share that with you because it was certainly a surprise for me on every front, both the surprise party, but also the introduction. Yes, so as Paul says, I've been working on this issue. I've been at Amnesty for these 5 years, and without doubt, the two reports that have created the most attention and hopefully external attention, but also for us as an organization, challenge has been the report we released, essentially planned to release the day shortly after I arrived, and nothing to do with my decision making at that point, was the apartheid report, finding that Israel and the occupied territories, the entirety of it was in violation of the law of apartheid. And then in December 24, which we're about to get into now, a second report was released over a year after the genocide had started, documenting Amnesty's evidence and legal analysis that Israel was in violation of the law on genocide. So what I'm going to do, I have some slides. I'm going to show them to you. If I may share my screen, if I'm able to do that, I think I am. So let me just try and see if this comes up. It'll help me to stay on track. Are you seeing my screen? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I am. So some of this is going to be most of it's going to be directly from Amnesty's work, but some of it's going to be from my own work. I think the process of actually defending our legal analysis and our evidentiary analysis, which you'll hear about, it led me to want to get a better understanding of what had happened to bring the genocide law into being, and to get to know this man and how he worked. And this is Raphael Lemkin, who is thought to be pretty indisputably the person who brought the word into being and then fought hard to bring the convention into being. And it was in my study of him and his work that I formed some views around the debates that we're still having in the law today, and I'm going to weave them in as well, which I think you may find interesting. But I'll try to be clear when I'm speaking on behalf of Amnesty and when I'm speaking on behalf of my own research. So we'll have a little look at the law on genocide and how it's articulated. I'll unpack the core findings. I'll have a little look back on how two of the key scholars, Lemkin being one, advanced protections for individuals and groups, talk a little bit about US engagement on genocide law, and then talk a little bit about where the law is today in the International Court of Justice. And I know one of your participants has experience of this as it arose in Eastern Europe, so hopefully that'll be interesting too. It certainly is still in play. Okay, so starting with the law, the Genocide Convention, which entered into force in 1948, in Article 2, this is the key article, defines genocide as any of the following acts, any meaning it can be any one of them. And if, I'm sorry, very important to read the language, committed with intent to destroy, because that specific intent has become a big part of the legal standard. In whole or in part, which is another important element of it. A national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And even the words as such have become of legal significance, meaning the words as such interpreted, does it mean that that it must be an intent to destroy the group as a group, not just to destroy them as a set of individuals, but because they are members of a group. And you are in violation of the law if you do one of the following. You kill members of the group, you cause serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Sorry, this third one is very important. You're deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The fourth and fifth have been of less pertinence with respect to Gaza, so I won't spend time on them. So what did Amnesty do? Over the course of mainly 2024, but it started soon after October 7, 2023, we began to conduct interviews with people on the ground. We had researchers in Gaza, in Israel, and across the occupied territories. But it was mainly interviews of people who were either in Gaza, working on Gaza, that made up the bulk of the interviews. We reviewed the statements of the Israeli government and its senior hierarchy from the president on down, senior military commanders, and individuals with authority, including documents that they had looked at. We have at Amnesty, we have a tech department that is quite sophisticated in how we verify photos, videos, and satellite imagery to make sure that it's accurate. We verify it. We can sometimes geolocate incidences, and then our consultants on the ground and working with our Middle East and North Africa team did specific analysis of destruction of infrastructure and other conditions of life. We very specifically looked at analysis of 15 airstrikes, and this was one of the things that led us to reach a finding, particularly around the question of intent, was specific airstrikes where the targeting happened often between the hours of midnight and 3 or 4 in the morning, hitting residential buildings where it was known that there were multi-generational families residing in those places, and leading to the loss of children, grandchildren, siblings, parents. There might sometimes have been in those contexts an individual who was affiliated in some way with Hamas. Sometimes we couldn't verify it, but in every case there was no discrimination shown in those contexts between those individuals and the people that were living in the same dwellings and around them. Okay, what kinds of findings of fact did the report, which is entitled "You Feel Like You Are Subhuman," which presented our evidence that the law had been violated, looked at those first 3 standards as evidence of specific intent. First, the scale of the killings of the members of the group. As I think you all know, we're now at more than 75,000 at least. That's the conservative estimate of the Ministry of Health. Independent research thinks the number is going to be closer in the end of loss of life caused by the genocide. Around 186,000 is a number that I've heard recently. The numbers of people who've been injured bodily and mentally far higher, as is always the case. You've essentially had 2 million people displaced, and many of them facing ongoing trauma as a consequence of that and all of the conditions of life that have been impacted. The perhaps the most dispositive of the three standards in terms of proving specific intent is the research that we've seen around the destruction of the conditions of life done in such a way that they could only be calculated to bring about the destruction of part or all of the group, as the law defines. And what does that mean? It means in the case of displacement, it's not just one displacement. It's often people being displaced. When we were by December 24, when we launched the report, many of the people that we had interviewed and had been following on the ground and verifying had been moved as many as 10 different times. A huge amount of the population, continue to be displaced. We estimate more than 2 million people have been moved at one point or another, many of them still living in informal dwellings in almost impossible circumstances today. They have no electricity, they have no access to clean water. If they want to have light in their tents at night, their only source of light is often their phones, but the only way to charge their phones is to walk to a charging station, which can be more than a mile away, to the nearest charging station. And then they will pay to charge their phone, bring it home, and use that as their light source. The fact that we're still in an aid blockade with a population that is facing this kind of trauma and food insecurity, water insecurity, with the entire water system having been either destroyed or put in peril. What's happening today in Lebanon, the destruction of the water system, is a template that was first done in Gaza. And many groups still that are supposed to be providing humanitarian services there, not able to do so. We've all seen the imagery and the realities around the destruction of housing and health systems, the targeting of clinics and hospitals. We, as Amnesty, documented many cases of systematic torture of individuals who had been detained, and all, I won't say all, but many of the aspects of life which are dependent on functioning infrastructure destroyed, and the targeting of infrastructure that would allow social and cultural life to continue. So the report is long. It's 286 pages. We think in any of those three standards, the legal threshold, which is a high legal threshold, has been met, and not just in the scale of the harm, but the nature and particularly the patterns of the harm. When sites that were, for example, being used to provide basic food security. One of the things I found most remarkable in visiting Gaza was the innovation of local populations in where and how they found ways to grow food sustainably. And many of those sites destroyed initially, and then there would be further attacks later to make absolutely sure that they could not be used long after any kind of military threat had been removed from the area. So it's that kind of pattern of violence, patterns of displacement, the systemic denial of aid, not just the random denial and then an apology, as has happened in other contexts, and the addressing of it, but the systemic denial of it, that led us to draw conclusions around specific intent. Before I get to the reflections around Lemkin and others, I just want to say that I'm sorry, there's a typo at the beginning of this. So that engagement with rep is not, I think I was just making changes earlier on. But the report, when we launched it, which was still during the last days of the Biden administration, we did not, and nor did we expect to. This had happened with the apartheid report as well. We did not engage in significant substantive discussions on the evidence we presented. There was, what you call, I don't know, civil disagreement from the State Department that the report added to the body of knowledge, and that our conclusion that the threshold for genocide had been met was a valid conclusion. But there was a significant amount. It was probably the most covered report globally that Amnesty has released, and we do a lot of reports. You won't be surprised to hear that the response to the report in the USA and in Israel was different from just about any other context. There was in both context, well, Israel rejected it out of hand and rejected its motivations. In the USA, there was skepticism about the motivations for the report, and by the government, a rejection of the findings that was, and no desire to engage in it. The new administration and Congress have not engaged with our report in a direct way, although it's very clear to us that there is no common ground there or desire to discuss the evidence. They have recently, we included our analysis in a report we recently released about the workings of the Trump administration this last year. And when asked about it by USA Today, the Trump administration said that I and Amnesty have Trump derangement syndrome and left it at that. Okay, I'm going to just share a little bit and then I'll stop. I just want to make sure I'm on time I've got about 5 minutes. I just want to briefly give you a sense of what I took from doing some research about Raphael Lemkin. He was a remarkable individual, but he wrote this book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, which is about 700-800 pages, and 400 pages of it are essentially what he was able to collect in the way of Nazi edicts as he moved from Poland, where he ultimately lost, I believe it's more than 40 of his family members to the genocide. He moved first to Sweden, and he only had 2 suitcases, and they were filled with these Nazi edicts, which he held in Sweden and then got invited to the United States to Duke University to finish his research. And what he essentially did reading these edicts is put together an argument that there was a pattern of conduct happening, if looking across these 8 areas, that demonstrated that, and he created the word in this book, in chapter 8, there was an attempt to commit a genocide going on. And he analyzed what a genocide was under each of these headings. It was essentially around what he observed as the systematic destruction of the life of the community in a way that is perhaps more general than the law reads today, because it included a deep analysis of how the Nazi regime was destroying the cultural and economic life and the ability to procreate. And in fact, didn't at that time, when he first wrote the book, he didn't have deep evidence of the camps and specific evidence of the taking of Jewish life in the camps. His argument was that when a population is targeted in this way, in all of these different facets, that is what constitutes a genocide. He was a contemporary of this man, Hersch Lauderpacht, who also was deeply concerned that the Nazis had undertaken a kind of crime that had not yet had a standard that was applicable or strong enough to meet the severity of what they had done. And so he made an argument that there needed to be a new standard called the Crimes Against Humanity. He wrote a book called the International Bill of Rights, and these two men, from essentially 1945 onwards until 1948, argued that international law needed to be grounded on these standards. And at some level, they were at competition, particularly for the attention of Robert Jackson, who was the chief prosecutor for the United States in the trial in Nuremberg. And in the end of the day, Lauderpacht, for various reasons, and partly because of the way the other parties, it wasn't just the United States, it was the British, the French, and the Russians, but Lauderpacht was the more convincing of the two. And in Nuremberg, while genocide had been cited in the indictment, it was not actually found as one of the violations that those who'd been charged in Nuremberg were guilty of. What they were found guilty of is crimes against humanity. This was a depressing and difficult moment for Lemkin, but he continued to do his work and to try and convince both other countries and the United States itself that a genocide convention ought to be the first human rights convention that that countries would agree to. And in that, he ultimately had a victory, because on November 9th, 1948, the Genocide Convention came into being. It was only on the 10th that the next day, that the Universal Declaration went into being. And many of you will know that the Universal Declaration was supposed to be the groundwork for an international Bill of Rights, which actually never got signed as such. There was disagreements between the East and the West. We ended up with two different conventions, and some were signed by the Eastern states and the other signed by Western states, and that's where that was left. But meanwhile, the Genocide Convention, the first human rights treaty, then became an important international treaty as far as the United States was concerned. The African American community took the charge of genocide very seriously, and including making the case that a genocide had occurred in the south of the United States. This was received by many in the US government as a potentially politically dangerous, and that they were not sympathetic to it. And had it not been for the saying indefatigable is an understatement, the tireless efforts of Senator William Proxmire, who let me just look at my notes and get the number right here. I think he raised the question of whether the United States would sign the law on genocide in 3,200 speeches. Every day the Senate was in session from January 11, 1967 to February 19th, 1986. And eventually, as a testament to those efforts, the US Senate signed it into law in the 80s, and the US is now a signatory to the Genocide Convention. Okay, I'm going to go 2 or 3 more minutes, because I think we can get into this more in questions. Even though the US signed the Genocide Convention in the 80s and was broadly supportive of it, it's not been the case that it's continued to call for its robust application, and there has not been case law on the genocide for almost 50 years. The cases below are important. There was a mention of the Bosnia v. Serbia case in 1996, which was transformative, I agree, in terms of the understanding of the crime of genocide. And then there was another case in Croatia v. Serbia, which took a very conservative line on what the standard is for the application of genocide, particularly on this question of specific intent, which is now before the court in two cases: the Gambia versus Myanmar case and the South Africa versus Israel case, and will be adjudicated in the coming years. I'm not going to get into this. I'm going to see if you're interested in getting into this, because I want to save time for questions. But these are some of the things that I could speak to around whether context matters. What does it mean to destroy a population? Is genocide a more severe crime than all other crimes? If you want to talk more about specific intent, I'm happy to do so. Is it possible that one can commit a genocide in the middle of a war or with any other intents? And is there still a genocide that is ongoing in Gaza? And if so, why? I'm happy to speak to any of those or anything else that you might be interested to dig deeper on. And I'll stop there.
If people have questions for Paul, could you please raise your virtual hands? And I'll see if there's anything in the chat too, but I don't see anything so far. Does anyone have questions for Paul or Seamus?
Bob Ward.
Bob Ward?
Yeah, I not surprisingly was fascinated by the next to last slide with the question about the dearth of case law, the dearth of findings. And I'll be a little bit more transparent than I had intended to be. I have some serious concerns about that, both with the letter, to a certain extent with the amnesty conclusions, that since there's almost no example of a tribunal finding that a genocide has occurred, is it ethical and responsible for a non-tribunal to discern that a genocide has happened and level that accusation? Please let me underline, I have no sympathy for what has been done in Bosnia and Serbia, in Darfur, in Rwanda, and anywhere else. I'm actually asking the case of the use of the word genocide when actually there's so few cases that have been adjudicated and found in fact to cross the threshold.
Nora, how would you like me to offer a reflection or take more questions, or how should we do this?
Why don't you go ahead and answer that one? I don't see any more hands up right now.
Yes, Bob, I think it's a serious question, although I don't think we see ourselves as Amnesty as adjudicating anything, but you still make a good point. If threshold has never been met in the law, then is it the right thing to do to make the case that the threshold, to make the evidentiary case, which is what we're doing, and legal analysis, that the threshold has been passed? I think there's an ethical and there's a strategic question. The strategic question is, well, if you're trying to prevent harm from happening, will you make much of a difference if that threshold is so high? And from a strategic perspective, we had two views on this. First, we don't believe that the threshold should be so high, meaning we think the court has been, for reasons we can debate, very conservative in its application of the Genocide Convention. It has very restricted. It is essentially said that unless you can demonstrate that there is no other conclusion that can be drawn than the intent was there to destroy the population, you can't find genocide. And the court is actually, and I've talked to quite a few scholars about this, I think what's happening now in both the two cases before the court is it's actually reviewing that standard as having been too conservative. And it may end up saying there's a slightly lower standard, which is that you can't, that if you can reach the conclusion that no other reasonable inference can be drawn from a pattern of conduct that a genocide was intended, then the standard is met, which is slightly lower. And in our view, the pattern of how harm was done to the population reveals that threshold of intent. And we think we're contributing to hopefully the court's consideration of the standard. But that takes me to the second strategic point, which is what you referred to earlier on, I think, in your comments about Bosnia, which is because genocide is viewed actually wrongly in the law as the crime of crimes. It is not a more severe crime than crimes against humanity. There is no legal hierarchy that says, and there sitting above them all is the crime of crimes. It doesn't work that way. It is a legal standard based on the nature of the crime as defined in the law, and crimes against humanity are defined in a different way. But because there is, in not just the public imagination, but in a lot of legal jurisprudence, such gravity to the crime of genocide that putting it into the public domain as a legal standard that should be considered with respect to Gaza has in itself changed the nature of the conversation around what is going on in Gaza, because people associated with such horrific crimes. And that has, in our view, as a human rights organization, both deepened the conversation and sometimes it has made it harder to have the conversation. But we have, in the main, felt that we have helped to deepen the understanding of Gaza, of the reality in Gaza, through this research and advocacy. I think that would be the sense of the Amnesty community. There are some Amnesty members, I think, on this call who may have their own views on that. But that's certainly my sense as an executive director here.
Paul has a question. Paul Barker has a question.
Your work focuses primarily on Israel's actions in Gaza, but it seems to me that their actions in the West Bank and in Lebanon and now Iran bear some similarities in their mass destruction of civilian property, schools, universities, and hospitals, displacement of people, especially in Lebanon. So one is, where can we start thinking about, does genocide apply to those? And the second one is, what is the culpability of the United States in this? Because we provide and fund most all these weapons that Israel is using. We put absolutely no restrictions on them for practical purposes.
So not surprisingly, Paul, I agree with you on all of the facts you've just laid out. And I do think, as the example for me of the way that they're targeting water systems in and moving populations and threatening populations who don't move. So displacement and destruction of conditions of life. It's a copybook of what happened in Gaza, now happening in southern Lebanon. And I'm sure I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on this, but there may be military strategy there as well. The question, though, of whether it meets the genocide threshold is a research burden that Amnesty has not taken on, and I will say I would normally in my role be involved in conversations around whether it ought to be taken on. I have not heard us lean heavily into that question right now. The facts of Gaza in particular, even, and we've done a lot of work, for example, during the apartheid report on the West Bank and on East Jerusalem and on Israel proper. But the fact of Gaza and how movement was constrained and the nature of the attacks gave us deep confidence that a case could be made that this was designed to destroy at the very least a specific part of a population. I'm not sure that we think yet that we have the basis. By basis, I don't mean that it's not happening. I mean that our ability, our capacity to analyze whether that kind of approach is happening, either in any of the contexts that you name. On your second point, agree entirely as well. We have the central pillar of our advocacy and because we aren't our hope is to stop harm happening in Gaza, and waiting for the International Court of Justice to reach a ruling has never been our theory of change. That's how we do that. That'll hopefully help other populations in other spaces. But we have been trying to get the US to stop sending weapons to the context. That's been our main focus. Building public pressure on what they're doing, helping people understand it. And, we believe that we have made significant headway in building both public pressure and the resulting political pressure, and to build a constituency, but we haven't succeeded in preventing, obviously, and looking at what the military of Israel is now doing and how reliant it is on US military support. I think enough is said there.
Thank you, Paul. We have a group of advocacy teams across the country, the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And a lot of what we're doing is to stop sending weapons to Israel.
Well, yes, I know that, and we are very proud to have any affiliation with that work that you do, and which you're well known for doing.
Here's a question in the chat. I'll get to you, Catherine, but someone has one in. What is the connection between these crimes? Even if the violence of the last few years subsides, does the ongoing system of apartheid constitute the continuation of the genocide?
Well, we do believe that if in order to, and we documented this in our genocide report, one of the factors that helped us to understand the pattern and the intent was the context, and looking at the context, the fact of the ongoing apartheid, the fact of the ongoing occupation, were deeply important in understanding for us in making our case on the genocide. But that is different. So yes, the apartheid is a very important contextual element of understanding whether or not there's a genocide. But apartheid in itself is not, it might have been necessary in us making our case, but it's not sufficient to make the case that you could get to a state of apartheid that is by definition then crossing the genocide threshold. They are in different conventions. The apartheid is in the Rome Statute, and there's an apartheid convention as well. And so as an organization that seeks to apply both the law and the evidence, we will apply them to whatever legal standard we think will have relevance and political traction in that moment. And so we have not conflated the two legally, but we do bring them together in terms of helping people to understand the context.
Thank you. Catherine Spinner?
Thank you. What I'm wondering is it useful for you if a body of a small denomination says Israel is committing genocide? We believe this. Or are there other ways we could spend the time that we have together besides passing a minute that says it's genocide and we're against it?
Well, you might not be too surprised to hear that my answer is yes. It would be useful, and you're being humble, but a lot of people take what you all do very seriously because there is an appreciation for your motives and your the way that you work as a values-based advocacy group that comes from a respected, what did you call it, small denomination. So yes, and I think in this moment you should be reserving your time and energies for more than that. I think it would add value, and the momentum is going in that direction, and the genocide is, in our view, still ongoing, and it's like many other things that are going on in this country at this moment. It has to reach a level of public concern and awareness and awakening that becomes impossible to ignore. And it's going in that direction, but it will help both in terms of just being there, but also your credibility. And yes, I think you should be thinking about other things, particularly with this war that is escalating. And I think most of us are getting more and more worried as time goes by as to whether there's anybody sensible, capable of bringing peace back to the context.
Thank you. Carol Abu Musa.
Hello, my name is Carol and I'm in Charlotte. First I wanted to start with the point about Iran and Lebanon in just little me not really being like not representing anybody, but like if there's any way that like Amnesty or other groups can be encouraged to whether now or in the in the coming, hopefully not too long from now, future, like look into the Lebanon, what's happening in Lebanon and Iran, and investigate if there's a possible genocide. I would really appreciate that because I I make daily calls to Congress as just little old me, and I want to know with confidence, like or relative confidence, whether to use the word in that context or not, and just have some basis for that. I have a question about like from one of the questions that you put up on the slide. I wanted to know if you could dive deeper into the like can genocide coexist with other intents, like in the context of war or anything like that. And in particular, I'm curious to know if someone from the same country like be like guilty of or participate in genocide for people of that same country. So I think of Sudan. Now I know that in that context, like I would imagine Amnesty has not looked into the current situation in Sudan and from the lens of genocide, but I like without asking you to make that analysis, I just want to know if that is a possibility that it can be from the same country. It could also be applicable in other places as well. So I'd love to learn more about that. Thank you.
So thank you for your questions. I'll take back your point to colleagues. I please know that I mean, and I do hear the specificity of saying it would be helpful to look at whether a genocide was ongoing now in Lebanon or possibly other contexts. I please do at least know that we're trying urgently to document everything we can about the contexts and particularly loss of civilian life and attack on civilians and civilian infrastructure. So that's ongoing now. And if there's a basis that we think we can I can't speak for the researchers, but I know this is the mindset. If what they're establishing are the kinds of patterns of conduct, and we know we can document it and get it done fast, then I know it will be considered if it looks like it's destroying a part of the population in the same way. And partly, in a way, we had only done one piece of genocide research before Gaza, which was in Myanmar in 2018, 2019. But we learned a lot about how to do the research in Myanmar. We applied it to our work in Gaza and did 280 pages of research. That muscle is stronger now, so we will be able to look with more alacrity at other contexts. To your second question, it is I'm glad you pulled it out. So to be clear, it is one of the defenses that the government of Israel has used, which is it couldn't be a genocide because we have military objectives. We're trying to free hostages. We're trying to destroy Hamas. We're trying to secure our population. Those are our intents. So it cannot be our intent to destroy the population. And the jurisprudence is clear on this. You can have multiple intents. You can be seeking to prosecute a war by destroying a population. You can be seeking to defend yourself by destroying a population. So the fact that they have some intents, they may credibly have an intent to seek out and destroy Hamas's ability to prosecute war, does not mean that because that intent exists, they couldn't have a genocidal intent. So yes, they can coexist, and we've sought to debate this, but it's been hard to do so in direct ways. But I think mainly you hear less of that defense now about we couldn't be specific intent because of that. They will still say there is no genocidal intent. And this is all we're trying to do. But when you look at the patterns of conduct, even as they're going on today, it's very hard for them to justify that. I think I've spoken to there was something else. I'm sorry, Carol, did I miss
No
your last
worries.
question?
It's can
Right,
a
yes.
group of the same country be?
Yes, I think it's a really interesting question. I want to say yes, because it doesn't say it says the population, if we go back to the law, it isn't just nationality, it can be ethnicity. So take, for example, in the Sudan context, where many of the conflicts are breaking down along ethnic lines. You can definitely have one ethnic population seek to destroy another ethnic population in whole or in part. Although if you look in the law, I'm just thinking of, the law in 2005 in the Bosnia case, they determined there actually was a genocide when the only population that had been destroyed with specific intent was a population of boys and men who had been captured in one context. So it was one subpart of the population that had been targeted, and that was deemed to meet the genocide threshold.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Paul Parker has a question in the chat. He says, since 1949, Israel's continued violations of international law with the West's support seems to have gutted international humanitarian law. What is the future of international law? If you want to,
And there's only 3 minutes to go. Thanks for the easy one, Paul. Because I'm coming to the end of my term, I've been in a little bit of a reflective mood. And on Monday, I was at Notre Dame University in South Bend, and they asked me to give some reflections. And one of the questions they asked me to reflect on was the future of international law. And I'm not going to give you the thing, but I'll give you the headlines that I went with, which is one of the speech was in, I don't want to say violent agreement with you, strong agreement with you that international law and human rights law has been tripled, not starting just now, in fact, over the last 20 years, but deeply accelerated by what's happened over the last period. And I'm not sure there's any way back for it. And I will say that a lot of the last 20 years was about the increasing irrelevance of international human rights law and humanitarian law in stopping actors from violating the norms that are held. And so it's gone from sort of growing irrelevance to an all-out assault when you have people like Stephen Miller saying the law is just a nicety. This world is ruled by force, and that's the only rule that matters. And then when Trump is challenged on that by the New York Times, he says, is international law constrain you? He says, no. Well, what does constrain you? My own morality and my own mind. The most powerful leader in the world saying that. So yeah, it's in deep trouble. The last part of my speech was about the fact that if we have been growing increasingly irrelevant and we're now in crisis, we have to make an opportunity from the crisis. There needs to be a reset. There needs to be some humility around where we're at now. And there needs to be a strong commitment for nations to work together to recenter the rule of law and to recenter the rule of law on the principle that all rights for all people everywhere has to be a foundational principle of it. And that's going to take a lot of work, but if ever the human rights movement had a calling, it's now. And I will say in my time, Amnesty, the work has never felt more relevant. We've had more members than we've ever had. We've more supporters than we've ever had. People want us to take action and they want us to be strong. And I know that for a group such as yours, there's going to be wind in your sails too. So I'm glad you're taking time to be with each other on a Thursday night. And I wish I could stay with you to hear it all, but I won't. Actually, I probably need to go to bed. But I'm very grateful for having had the chance to spend a bit of time with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was great, Paul.
It's nice. We'll see you in Ireland.